G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week. Now, I know every video, basically I say that I want to try and get these down in length because they are long, but I think so much nuance needs to be added to a lot of these incredibly complex topics. And one thing I have really been looking at and going over is I think a lot of this is oversimplified because oversimplification helps basic narratives and not question on that. And the more you add nuance, the more difficult it becomes and you're really stripping away that pseudo environment. And we'll be talking more about that. But why today do I want to go over a lot? Well, we're going to look at the tactical stuff. We'll look at strikes, we'll look at maps, we'll compare maps, the usual. But then I want to talk more political and strategy, and it will be separate elements in the video. But the reason I don't want to make separate videos is I don't want to give this impression that these are mutually exclusive. They are not. People will try and make it exclusive to fit a narrative that tactics have nothing to do with negotiations like kilometre squares movement or strikes or this or that, where no, what we know is that war is politics by other means. And from diplomacy to tactics to strategy to grand strategy, all of this is part of what you'll hear me refer to as the orchestra of war. So as I mentioned, we'll be going over the maps, but then I want to go over more in length what NATO Chief Mark Rutte has said about the then basically imminent threat of Russia and go over why is this messaging happening now? That the messaging for years was that Russia has been strategically defeated, and for NATO, it's not a threat, that a few tens of billions of dollars and Russia will be wiped out, or has already been. But why is the stage being set very differently? What is actually going on here, and what has he actually said? Then we'll talk more about China, and then we'll look at what I see as the biggest threat facing the Western world and outcomes of this war too. So we've got a lot in that to go over, and I want to keep that as more of a conversational podcast style video because it's easier on me and I hope that it's easier for you to consume. I know that may be better in a perfectly laid out video with infographics, but as a day-to-day uploader, I don't have time to do that, and I don't have time in my day to make these much more in-depth than I do. Trust me, I work very long weeks. Now, let's firstly talk about this, as I think this is important. And Tatarigami UA, and many in my audience have picked up on this, and I agree. Tatarigami UA has a very large pendulum swing from some of the most objective, unbiased, real-world analysis, but then other times can swing into large bias washing machine style. But I really implore anyone, because I am on that pendulum and have been as well, it's very difficult to internalize bias and try and get past that. But it's very difficult, and I applaud anyone who really tries to move on through this as well. Of course, there can be a lot of pressure on the back end as well, but Mr. Tatarigami UA has tweeted this today: being a propagandist is often more rewarding than being an analyst. And have a look at bloggers from YouTube to Twitter to Telegram, whatever, and have a look at where analysts, especially if they try and be objective, and look at their views to everything compared to where propagandists or activists, if you will separate the terms, and look at where they are sitting. Analysis that doesn't support the preferred narrative rarely gets positive feedback, followers, or financial backing, unlike simple, optimistic messages that offer comfort. That being said, I'll stick to analysis, and I think he's very true here. And what I will say is those that try and give objective analysis that isn't just there to give comfort and activism, of course, there is not much beauty in doing that. It can be a fairly tough road. So for guys like him, guys like myself, a lot of others, the best way is directly supporting to continue it as well, because I believe it is unbelievably important. Now, to tactical stuff first. Now, once again, overnight, Ukraine has been absolutely hammered with Goran drones, missiles, Iskanders, all sorts. And Russia is continuing its campaign of attritional warfare strategic strikes, that it is striking in, and again, with attritional warfare, you're attritting as well, but they are trying to maintain the pressure on these strikes and attrit down the air defence at a faster rate than they're attriting their own stockpiles. And as I said, that the longer this can keep up, the more success this is going to have. It is basically impossible to actually ever assess the battle damage assessment, especially as you can't get satellite imagery over these parts of Ukraine. But we do know multiple strikes, multiple days, things are going to be getting through and are going to continue getting through as well. It will be interesting to see how long Russia can maintain this increased tempo. Now let's have a look at the maps, and there is a fair bit to go over today. So here, of course, we have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now the red check that you'll see, that is ground Russia has made over the past 24 hours. If there was blue check, that but Ukraine. Now, firstly, what I want to do is step back to the 10th. Now, we have 2 map updates today, but on the 10th, there's a few updates which I want to bring your attention to. So we come down here into the south on the Huliapol front, Malanivkia. And this again shows the quality of Suryak mapping's updates. 2 days ago, Suryak Maps said that this area that was grey has turned red and that the Russians are on the outskirts of Malanivkia. Today, Suryak's crystal ball has proven to be correct. And then we'll come opposite end of the country, right up into the north, and we have Sumy. And this is where we see that Russia has continued advancing. 197 kilometre squares has now been occupied here. I think it's probably 10 or 20% more than that, and that's probably conservative, that Russia has crossed into the outskirts of Yanakivka and some of these main supply roads as well. The continuing advancement. Remember, this is yesterday's update. Let's go here to here, say a 2.8 to 3 kilometre advancement, depending where you measure this, and that this front is still moving, and that should be of concern. So let's have a look and compare some maps in here, and I want to show you a strike as well. Suryak here showing definite movement here, crossing of this road, and northern southern advancements in this area. So yep, we can definitely confirm that. But we do have a then tactically important airstrike from Ukrainian fighter aircraft here as well. Or at least it is said to be fighter aircraft. I've seen some say it looks like a controlled DEM, but I believe most likely it was a missile of some sort. And just in Volodymyr here, there's a bridge sitting right here that by this footage, it appears that Ukraine has destroyed or damaged. Again, we don't have great footage of the aftermath of this or at all. Wait out on that. I'll see if we get it, but we can see then a strike on that bridge there. And of course, that can inhibit movement of logistics right down into these front areas. Okay, so an area which you've probably heard me talk about a lot, and I cannot believe that the pro-Ukrainian bloggers weren't all over, was around Thankyou. Now, this map hasn't showed it, and I don't know why it didn't, but the Russia appeared to be in a pretty bad way for a few days in this area, potentially being surrounded or strategically cut off. Physical and strategic is different in that aspect, but at least from AMK mapping, it does appear that this has now then some level of respite. So this is the map that he showed, Thankyou here, that the Ukrainians had crossed from then the border here across this main service route. And what AMK has said, the roads supplying the Russian garrison at Thankyou have been unblocked after the arrival of reinforcements from the northeast. Ukrainian forces were pushed away from the highway after a series of Russian counterattacks. A partial rotation of elements from the 56th Airborne Reg has been carried out, and elements of the 1427th Motor Rifle Regiment are now being brought in through the unblocked supply routes to alleviate the pressure on the village. Additional counterattacks have been made on Ukrainian positions in the southwestern part of the village, with some success towards Krasny Perlok Street. And this is one of the bits we talk about on attritional warfare, that attritional war is won by having the highest low-end formations. But your high-end formations, what they are there to do is go front to front and either secure, seek, gain, hold ground, unblock areas, or exploit areas as well. And we see this happen with, say, some of like the Azov regiment to go in and move around areas, and this has appeared to be what has happened at Thankyou, is more high-end formations have moved in to unblock the situation that was occurring there. Now, let's then jump up today. We've turned this on so you'll see the red check, and we do have a fair bit of red check to go over today. Now, the most important one, or one of, is around Seversk, Belahorivka. You can see movement being made in here by Ukraine's deep state map, of course, linked in with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. But let's talk about this from AMK mapping. And remember, Suryak has showed Verkhonomayansky and a lot to the north of here has been under Russian control for some time. Russian forces have broken through Ukrainian positions northeast of Seversk. Remember, this front has had relatively very, very minimal movements over a number of years, establishing control over the remaining important trenches in the large forest on the tactical heights south of Hirokivka. So right in here, south of this area. Forward units are now storming Serebryanka, although control over neighbouring Horivka is unconfirmed. Both villages lie completely in ruins, making holding a permanent presence nearly impossible. It is likely the Russians will bypass this area from the south via the last section of tactical heights. You can see on his map here, and let's give you a couple of areas to then have a look at the maps and see where these bypasses may take place. So move this across. This is Seversk sitting down in here. This yellow area is where it's been moved up to the north of Verkhonomayansky, and slightly to the south of this Hirohovka as well, but further movement down into this Serebryanka as well, securing along the water line and the tree lines in here as well. This would essentially establish a wedge between the very fortified forest north of the Seversky Donets River and the stronghold city of Seversk, the heights and the southeast. It would also mean the Russians have fire control over Seversk. The tactical importance of holding Belahorivka, and especially the chalk quarry, had the forces of Ukraine becoming more and more obvious every day. And this is the chalk quarry, Belahorivka in here, and the importance of those heights and further movements into this front. And now that we have seen that move, we may see that move now faster. So let's move up and down the maps. We do have a fair bit of red on this map today. We can see in the direction of Yamranivka, we can see further Russian movement being confirmed on this map. But then I want to come to the western side of this. This is, of course, the Pokrovsk eastern flank. And then we have this Suryak map here. And what he's claiming is that the Russians have got a foothold in this village of Koptieve here too, above Malanivkia. So if this is correct, this is advancement or difference in the maps of about 6 kilometres. So that is a fair way. So keep an eye out on this movement here. And as we have said, that Russia will try and push north and then east and west, then north, then east and west to go up and expand. We've spoken about the advantage in that as well for saturation and desaturation of offensive and defensive assets. Then we'll move back into Toretsk. Now, as I always say, incredibly difficult area to get an idea on what is actually occurring up here. And we have seen that these maps and the geolocations are very, very different. We have geolocations all the way up through these areas, some of them some 6 kilometres behind in areas. We see then to the east of Delivkia, some ground being made up, this tree line in here, and some withdrawals out of the centre of Toretsk. But again, very, very hard area. I don't think we'll get confirmation on it until we truly know what has happened there with further geolocations as well. But the Russians are working on the flanks of these areas. And then we come to the north and the northern flank of Chasiv Yar and have a look that Russia is continuing to expand around Hirovkia, at least occurring to Suryak maps. But we have seen a number of maps confirming movement up to the canal in here. Now we'll come back down into then Pokrovsk, and we can see the grey zone coming right up to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast as well through Hodorkovye as well. Not surprising following those geolocations yesterday and more confirmed movement in this direction. This is then being confirmed by Suryak maps with movement in a few areas around to the west of Uspanivkia and down in the south of down in the direction of Oleksivka. Remember, he shows this as far more flat in here, and we have seen many geolocations in Oleksivka, and I believe from Hodorkovye to Oleksivka would likely be very just squared off rather than how this looks. Yesterday, we then spoke about Velika Novosilka and how I believe it would look due to the nature of the warfare rather than maneuver on these like single axes coming out. And this is starting to look more in line with what I believe it would now that this is filling in around the base here. And we can see more of this, but again, not showing the northern extreme that Syriac is showing, as Syriac is showing right up into Qomar and far more broad of this front line, all the way from Bulatske to Odrane coming then under control. So basically, if you were to just draw a line straight up here and across, and as I've said, I'm not saying one or the other is right or wrong, but I'm saying in the nature of warfare that we are seeing, it's more likely to be like this as of that grind forwards. And we can see as well, he's showing this is just the corner of Oleksivkia. Again, I think that this pocket in here is likely being closed up. Again, Bahatar and Oleksivkia, areas we've seen multiple flags go up, are still not even shown in grey zone on this map. So a fair bit that we have gone over there, and I don't think that I've missed anything, but if I have, we'll go back over it tomorrow. So this is going to be wordy. It's going to be a fair bit. There's a lot in this, and if I get a bit lost, I also apologise. Sometimes my numbering isn't fantastic. But let's again look at what Mr. Tatarigami UA has said, and this tells us a lot about goals of this war, overall goals, and what may become too. And I think this, where we're seeing changing in narrative, and we're seeing what used to be coined as propaganda now become accepted narratives, even down to if you said proxy war, if you even mentioned those words back in the day, you would be bloody stoned. And then we see Boris Johnson using those words all the time and are being accepted, okay? Tatarigami UA says this: when I talk about the war in right, both sides in a war can lose. It often generates confusion. Many assume that war is a zero-sum game, that one side's loss is inherently the other's gain. But this isn't always the case. War is not an end in itself. It's a tool of statecraft intended to achieve political objectives. Karl von Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. When neither party accomplishes its strategic aims, both effectively lose, having expended immense resources and more critically, human capital, without achieving their desired outcomes. In such cases, both sides may find themselves in a worse position than they were before the war begun. The Iran-Iraq War is a decent and recent historical example. After nearly a decade of fighting, both countries suffered serious human and economic losses, only to return to roughly the same territorial status quo, diminished and destabilised. In the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine's fundamental objective is to preserve its independence and maintain control over most of its territory. This, in effect, means denying Russia of its strategic aim. I think the fundamental objective should be the survival of the state, and the survival of the state is the survival of the people. Let's continue. Russia's realistic goal, by contrast, may no longer be the outright occupation, but rather rendering Ukraine unviable as a functioning state. And this is what attritional warfare does: undermining its economy, depopulating its cities, and precipitating long-term socio-political collapse, demographic issues, economic issues, and leaving Ukraine in such an unviable state that EU and NATO membership may then completely be off the table, as well as the longer the war goes on, emigration, of course, out of the state, but also you're not having babies when war is raging and you don't know what the future is going to be. But achieving this comes at an extraordinary cost for Russia as well. The Russian state itself suffers economic and demographic decline. Even a successful outcome in Ukraine could leave Russia so depleted that it enters its own period of internal instability and geopolitical marginalisation. Again, now you can see the interest that was looked at years and years ago of, quote, extending Russia, and then further extending into the future a historical threat or enemy too, that's used to deplete down and reduce that threat too. And again, war comes at major cost. If Ukraine manages to repel Russian advances, why wouldn't that constitute a victory? Because as noted, winning a war is not only about holding ground, It's about what remains afterward. A country left with ruined infrastructure, lost territories, millions of its citizens displaced, and a dramatically aged population with a GDP per capita of twice smaller than Mexico cannot claim a strategic win. If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention. And this is what I've been saying for a long time, is there's so much focus on territory, and that territory itself can just lead to being at just a Pyrrhic victory, and that survival of the state should be the number one element here. And the survival, first and foremost, is of the people, both physical survival of battlefield losses, but also people leaving and not coming back. And in peace negotiations as well, this needs to be taken into account, not just overly focused on just kilometres squared. Now, I wanted to go back over this, as I think we didn't touch on it enough. And the ISW, who has been reporting for a long time that Russia has been completely just hollowed out and they've got nothing left, I don't know, they're doing what everyone else is doing and trying to swing back around as a tool of the Western states. And they're quoting, of course, Mark Rutte here in that speech he did at Chatham House, which we're going to go actually over more in full. Now that Russia's working with then the PRC, North Korea, Iran, the axis of our people states, and again reiterating that Russia's going to be capable within 4 or 5 years of offensive operations against NATO, and saying that it doesn't, ISW assess Russia does not need to reconstitute its pre-22 levels before posing a threat to NATO states and could launch military operations against NATO state before 2030. Now, I don't know what this means, because if they don't reconstitute to pre-22 levels, but pre-22 level didn't have overall large victory against Ukraine in the beginning, is not going to have large victory less than that against NATO, okay, if it's not above that. What I will say, though, is lessons learnt. Would you rather, and I think this is a great thought experiment, leave your ideas on this, would you rather, if you're a state, opposing state, would you rather fight 2022 Russia or 2025 Russia? My answer to that would be I'd rather fight 2022 Russia, and that should be of concern. I think a lot of these political figures are starting to sort of swing around onto this. But what a lot of this doesn't take into account, for Russia to launch a war on NATO, less into Finland, but to launch a war on NATO where the concern is more around Poland, do they realise that they would have to conquer all of Ukraine first, and once conquering that area, be in really good standing, really good order of the military forces to then move on through? And like I said yesterday, or maybe the day prior, a lot of this is propaganda. And what we went over, the secret to propaganda, is to tell the truth in the appropriate form. So is Russia reconstituting at a faster pace and outproducing NATO? Yes, we know that. Are they planning an attack? In my opinion, based on everything we're seeing, no. But again, this is telling the truth of this reconstitution and the appropriate form, that then we need to spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions, due to the imminent threat of this. Meanwhile, realistically, the attack is fairly bogged down in eastern Ukraine, okay? And what this is making truth of the appropriate form so we can continue this and get what you need out of democratic societies. And what you're setting up is a pseudo-environment. We're seeing this laid from the pseudo-environment first laid of that Ukraine will have full strategic victory, and that pseudo-environment lasted 22-23, to now the pseudo-environment of there's real threat here to NATO in itself and the survival here, so we need to then further produce. And pseudo-environment, this is brought up by Walter Lippmann in his 1922 book, and we're going to actually go over a bit of that today, but it's where you select and frame what the public sees, hears, and is told. You're cherry-picking parts of this to influence then society, therefore you influence politics in democratic systems. We'll go over more of that in a second. So let's further expand on why I believe a lot of the US isn't buying some of this as well. The US will reduce funding allocated for military assistance to Ukraine. Pete Hegseth has said it's a reduction in the budget. The Pentagon hasn't released how much yet, but he has continued saying this administration takes a very different view of that conflict. We believe that a negotiated peaceful settlement is the best interest of both parties and our nation's interests, especially with all the competing interests around the globe. And there's no more details of this, but what I will say will go through the European rhetoric, especially from NATO Chief Mark Rutte. But I just don't believe that the current US administration is buying the European rhetoric about Russian invasion into NATO. The United States, they are a regional hegemon. They are a power balancer around the world. And their first order of risk assessment is China. And what they do not want is they don't want to tip the scales of power, pushing Russia closer to China. And a lot of that will mean making concessions. And we see this a lot with Trump's comments around not buying this and wanting to avoid this, around that the war would have never started, or it would have been avoided if he was in charge, or different policy and decisions were made. Now, and I think Trump, he may not agree with the war, but I think he can sympathise with Putin's position on NATO's movement. I think that's one thing Trump has more so, is he sympathises with seeing where a power leader like Putin will be seeing bits and pieces. It'll be interesting to get in a room with Trump and really hammer down on the point of what do you think about NATO movement further east and over since the end of then the Soviet Union. So what is NATO on about? So let's have a look at parts of Mark Rutte's talk at Chatham House. And this is what he said. Russia is teaming up with China, North Korea and Iran, aka the axis of upheaval. They're expanding their militaries and capabilities. Putin's war machine is speeding up, not slowing down. Russia is reconstituting its forces with Chinese technology and producing more weapons faster than we thought. I'm wondering when someone will take accountability for all this idea that everything was defeated 3 years ago. In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year. So 4 times. What I will say is there's a lot in this of China. Now, China's industry, we know, is 10x Russia's, as well as further technology in a lot of sectors. And if China was supplying this war like is being said, it would be a very different battlefield to what we are seeing. He continues about the numbers of 3,000 armoured vehicles, 1,500 tanks, and that Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. Again, he says 5 years again to hammer that point. Let's not kid ourselves. We're all on the eastern flank now. A new generation of Russian missiles travel at many times the speed of sound. The distance between European capitals is only a matter of minutes. Again, I thought that ships were being pulled out of washing machines because no high-tech weapons that could be made, and that now ones that travel hypersonically, that are minutes from capitals, are a real threat. There is no longer east or west. There is just NATO. China is modernising, expanding its military at breakneck speed. It already has the world's largest naval and building up its nuclear arsenal. He says to 1,000 operational warheads. He's not incorrect on this, but China's goal is 1,000 deliverable warheads. Those who stand against freedom and democracy are digging in, preparing for long-term confrontation. So basically the Western states who stand for this, then we have to dig in to oppose, because he's saying that this is what they are getting ready for, is all-out war. In 1936, Churchill posed a question during debate in the House of Commons. Will there be time to put our defences in order? Will there be time to make these necessary efforts? Or will the awful words "too late" be recorded? And again, I think there needs to be a lot of accountability from senior politicians and senior staff in the militaries to how the hell the European militaries end up so hollowed out. History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Don't worry, we have a lot more information coming breaking this down. We've just got to set the foundations of what we're going to talk about. It is clear that right across the alliance, we are not producing enough. We need to increase investment. We need to ensure the alliance can produce at scale and at speed. We need raw industrial capacity. We need cheaper electricity, access to critical minerals, and more engineering know-how. And these are a lot of problems. Cheap electricity, difficult now in Europe. Critical minerals, also difficult. We'll go over some rare earths in a second. Engineering know-how, that there is a huge hollowing out of STEM across many, many countries as well. Otherwise, the commitment to spend 5% of GDP in defence will be lost to production costs rather than invested in defence. And this is something I see again and again and again, is the amount of money that just goes into, it's not even production costs. A lot of it just goes into bureaucracy rather than actually getting the system at the end of the day. And remember, it's gone from 2% to now 5%. So we'll enhance and expand the industrial base right across the alliance. Now, this is in the Q&A. So what is the main threat to NATO members? Is it Russia? He says the long-term threat against NATO is Russia, no doubt. But you rightfully said there is more than Russia, and NATO never established to fight only the Soviet Union. Realistically, NATO was established to counter the Soviet Union. That was really the establishment of NATO, because that was the threat. Like, I don't know what, yeah, okay. But he says long-term the threat is still Russia. Well, how can that be long-term when you're telling us that economically it's ruined, strategically it's ruined, and realistically the threat against NATO as a whole, maybe not European NATO, but NATO as a whole in the West, it's not Russia, it is absolutely China. And what we see at the moment is enormous build-up in China of their military capabilities, absolutely. And he says that at the moment we can absolutely not compete with the industrial nature of China, and especially how cheap it is to produce reasonable quality equipment. And we do not know how good some of the Chinese equipment is, but we got a large 10-size boot up the arse the other day with the performance of the Chinese J-10 aircraft. Thank you to the Israelis for handing off, well, potentially, allegedly handing off the designs for that. But then we see these like 5th generation fighters, and of course you'll see in the comments these F-22 lovers going, oh, same radar cross-section as a fucking house. No one knows that other than some very, very top secret information held in China. But it's the development of this equipment too, and that J-10, the performance against potentially Rafale, again, you can't just rely on that. Look at a Chinese vehicle from 10 years ago compared to a newer BYD. Is it a German fucking C-Class Mercedes? No, but attritional war is about the highest low end possible. Industry, manpower, attrition, post-dark warfare. That we are not producing enough. And China is working together with North Korea, Iran, and Russia. They are all supporting. No, these countries are trying to work more with China. China's on its own bit. It's like America. They don't have any permanent friends or allies. They have strategic interests. And they are using this where it sees fit, and they'll drop it if they don't need it. Okay? In terms of strategy, is it Russia? Is it China? And it's the others working with them. And all of these. Because when you ask me, what is your first and main threat in long term, it is Russia, absolutely. Again, in my opinion, and as well what we saw from the US 2025 strategic overview of it was called, China is 10 times the threat Russia is in all elements, from grand strategy to politically to economically to absolutely militarily as well. And like I've said, I know there's claim China's fully in on this war. They're not. If it was, we wouldn't see 500 Garans, we'd see 5,000 a night. But we have to be conscious of the fact that this is all interconnected, what's happening in the Pacific. And the war in Ukraine, Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, clearly shows that all these countries work together. And that these countries want to put in the best possible area and leverage too. And we're doing the same thing, that at the end of the day, states will want to have their raison d'etre for the survival of their state first and foremost, even if it means jeopardizing then another state. Now, how do you explain people who are running a government, now a democratic government, how to explain to their voters why is so much money suddenly needed on defence? Numbers are going up, the government is taking time to commit to 2.5%. Suddenly, people are talking about 3, even 5, as you were saying. And yes, people are right to question this, because they were being told for years that Russia was defeated, that it's not a threat. And now it's gone from 2%, which people weren't reaching, to now 5%. How do you explain this to voters? And this goes back into exactly what I said here about this is setting up that pseudo-environment. The pseudo-environment at the beginning was a few $1 billion can go to Ukraine to win. Now it is where we need trillions of dollars in our own defence because there is imminent threat of Russia into NATO, even if the capability of Russia conventionally is not there to do that. And I don't believe that there's any a real appetite to do it either. People will say, Kremlin mouthpieces will say, I don't care what someone tweets. The appetite to do it and they may want to do it, but it doesn't mean it's realistic that could happen either. And he goes, the whole idea would have sort of a pleasant, peaceful living together with Russia is gone. Well, it takes two to tango to get rid of that idea. And we had such an opportunity when there was the fall of the Soviet Union to build relations, for Eurasian relations, if people would work together somewhat. He says Putin is clearly expansionistic. Now, again, I don't think it's clearly expansionistic. If it was expansionist as far as ground rather than leverage, or maybe historic, Russia would push south into the stands rather than west. Okay, anyway, he says, he talks this and forgets that he says NATO is 25 times bigger than Russia's 50 trillion and Russia's economy is 2 trillion. 2 trillion economy is producing 4 times as much ammunition as the whole of NATO is producing at the moment. Yeah, we hear this a lot about Russia is the same size as Italy, blah, blah, blah. This doesn't take into account purchasing power parity, and it's not taking into account what Mr. Root has said in one of these about we can't just have all the money going into, I'm trying to find it, what did he say? Anyway, he says in one of these slides that not all the money can just go into basically, as we said, bureaucracy and into industrial rather than actually producing systems at the other end. So that should be even more of a shock then, okay? He says you can never know and never allow a situation where ammunition piles are not sufficiently stocked. And here the Russians are outpacing us 4-1, 4 times as much as we're producing. Yeah, I think there should be some accountability for these stockpiles not being produced and some looking into we need to produce weapons cheaper as well. Says we need a 400 increase in air defence, and we have a heavily reconstituting Russia at a pace which is really threatening. They cannot mount a successful attack against NATO territory now, but in 3 to 5 years they might be able. And this is how I would explain this. So setting here, and what we say is if in 3 years, which we've already been in the war 3.5 years, in 3 years that Russia is going to be in a position to attack NATO and take on those states in NATO, it's probably the best idea to seek some level of peace now. Last one, then we'll get into a little bit more. We're just setting foundation. They ask about, well, will Ukraine join NATO? And then concession, will that be something that's on the table? And NATO Secretary pushes back and said the irreversible path for Ukraine and NATO, it is there unless there are major shifts. But we know the US, they are against this, so is Hungary, it's Slovakia, but again, reiterates the irreversible path into NATO. The problem is, what did I say? The survival of the state is statesman's first and foremost priority. Well, it should be the first and foremost priority. If NATO, European NATO pushes, Ukraine's in, could the US see this and go, well, we see that as war happening, so we are out. Again, we don't know, but the US is not going to step into war, especially with the current administration, for many. Okay? So this was off a guy behind the scenes. I thought I'd share this very interesting here concerning Schrodinger's Russia. And what I refer to is Schrodinger, of course, a lot of talk about quantum physics speaks about Schrodinger's cat is that if you put a cat in the box, that it's both alive and dead at the same time. And it goes into that type of physics. But what I've said is how can Russia be defeated and then a threat to NATO at the same time? It's either one or the other. Anyway, I think while many businesses and some national governments, especially in southern and central Europe, may be and not serious about the Russian threat, the Brussels bureaucrats are. Several months ago, I had a conversation with the former EU ambassador to Russia and China, who had been one of the negotiators on the Minsk Accords and is characterised by the Russians as a relatively adequate guy. Not going to say his name was private, but you'll be able to Google who it was. What he said basically was, yes, we do see Russia as a real military threat and the Brussels bureaucracy is in the mood for preparation for war. I wouldn't underestimate Europe in this regard. Even the resolve for confrontation comes from weakness and not strength. Europe wants to punish Russia for its misbehaviour and rebellion against the rules-based order. Furthermore, we see how the current European blob is grasping for power amid collapsing popular support and poor economic and social performance. The Russian threat is an excuse for them to become even more authoritarian to protect democracy. democracy, or as I say, practicing democracy for a lot of this is for them being in power. And we've seen this happen in a lot of elections recently. And I'm afraid that they may even let things slide into war with Russia if it helped to keep the train on the rails. Two sociological factors contribute to that. Number one, paranoia and anti-Russia inertia in Eastern Europe, for whom the Russian threat is their traditional bread and butter. Two, suppressed masculinity and aggression on the diversity, equity, inclusion shaped society. A lot of steam is being accumulated there. That people are pushing back against this, a lot of steam, but leaning that way as well, that you can't hate the Jews and the Muslims or complain about immigrants or whatever if the Russians are a legitimate target. So shaping that, trying to have a common enemy and trying to develop that common enemy back into the traditional bread and butter of point one. We'll talk about this more. I fear that such developments are bringing Finland into NATO and having Kaja Kallas at the helm of European diplomacy point a fat finger towards where a problem may occur. And about the find me the criminal, find me the person, I'll find a charge, to we'll find an enemy because we may need it as well. So we're going to go over a couple of books in this and go a little bit more in depth. Now, we're going to be going over Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, Planning for Protraction by Iskander Rahman. As, again, my podcast with him didn't go how I would like it to go, but there's some really good parts in this. The problem I see is a lot of analysts are just not willing to apply their own rules and logic onto something that has as much political anger around a topic such as this, and as well John Mearsheimer's Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So just bear with me in a sec. So Public Opinion, page 25, you go through this, speaks a lot about the situation of this conflict and as well about the pseudo environments we speak of. A complete story is lost in the sight of war in a melee of faction and counterfaction about the competence of the officers instead, and this is setting that stage, of letting the public act on all the facts which the generals knew. The authorities presented only certain facts, and these only in such ways as it would most likely to steady the people. In this case, the men who arranged the pseudo-environment knew what the real one was, but for a few days later an incident occurred, and speaking about then setting that stage, but you're setting just pieces off from that, and that comes off that propaganda we spoke of it's the truth set forth in the appropriate way. We speak about this problem that happened back in World War I. The editor of the French communique tells us that the battle dragged out. His colleagues and he set to neutralise the tenacity of the Germans by continual insistence on their terrible losses. So focusing only on losses, not on other bits and pieces. And this would be decided by attrition, that nobody believed in a war of movement. So focus primarily on losses and obsessed with those losses. And what do we see again and again happening of an obsession of losses while ignoring all these other elements taking place? That it was simply a matter of just killing Germans. The general public more or less believed the dogma, but it had constantly to be reminded of it in the face of spectacular German successes. Almost no day passed, but the communique ascribed to the Germans of an appearance of just as heavy losses, extremely heavy, spoke of bloody sacrifices, heaps of causes, hecatombs. Likewise, the Wiles constantly used the statistics of the Intelligence Bureau ad Verdun. 500,000 casualties put out, divided, a striking effect. So focusing on that, as he said, to then be reminded of those extreme losses in the face of success, the pseudo-environment that is being prepared. And I think we can apply that to a lot of what we are seeing here. The offensive engaged act to force their opponent, whose manpower is declining. That for more men onto the front line, and that in a few weeks the German force will be exhausted by this effort and find themselves confronted with all the forces of the coalition. The French command had converted itself to this belief by an extraordinary aberration of mind. Only the attrition of the enemy was ever seen. Only the attrition of the enemy was ever seen. It appeared that our forces were not subject to attrition. We saw the result, 1917. We learned to call this propaganda. A group of men who can prevent independent access to the event arrange the news of it to suit their purpose. That the purpose was, in this case, patriotic, does not affect the argument at all. The casualty figures of major content, which were spread about the world, are some of the same order. They were intended to provoke a particular kind of interference, namely that the war of attrition was going in favour of the French. So that then display of information there too, omitting to mention French dead, and it was designed to neutralise the effects of German territorial advances and the impression of power which the persistence of the offensive was making. And it was a view tended to make the public acquaintance here of demoralising defence strategy imposed upon the Allied armies. For the public accustomed to the idea the war consists of great strategic movements, flank attacks in circles and dramatic surrenders, they had to gradually forget that picture in favour of the terrible idea of matching lives of the war could be won. And we can see how that is set up in different ways. Again, let's continue on planning for protracted war and speak a little bit of China. Well, to give you some foundations here too before then we step into China. Since the end of the Cold War, America's military planning has placed a strong emphasis on winning short, sharp wars and using its technological prowess to rapidly seize the initiative in an era marked by ambiguity and the exquisite sensor and precision-strike networks. But military planners are now increasingly recognising the need for beyond the first salvo. So after those initial days, what then follows there? Wealthy and powerful as the PRC would most likely evolve into a protracted war of attrition. So a war with China would step into a war of attrition beyond the first salvo. And those satellites, they're going to be going down, and it steps into potential of power. Man, machine, industry, survival, will of nations. China's raw industrial might and the sheer scale and scope of its military build-up, which in many ways are historically unprecedented. If the US wishes to maintain a viable conventional deterrent in Asia, it will need to launch a once-in-a-generation construction and procurement effort, all while encouraging its even more industrially atrophied allies in Europe and Asia to do the same. And these are atrophied allies, absolutely. So it needs to pour this in. But it also, to do that, needs to have an environment of an enemy who is an imminent threat as well, to build this up. Don't worry, we are getting somewhere on this. And then into the tragedy of great power politics. And you should read through this. It is I think it's chapter 10, but it is Can China Rise Peacefully? And it speaks about the way that then the neighbours here have been tolerated, but also have accepted this. China's neighbours are certain to fear its rise as well. And they too will do whatever it can prevent it from achieving regional hegemony. Indeed, there's already substantial evidence that countries like India, Japan, and Russia, as well as smaller powers like Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam, are worried about China's ascendancy and are looking for ways to contain it. And this is where I've said it makes a lot of sense of what Trump is seeking concession, because, and Russia may do the same, due to China's then ascendancy and its rise. And in the end, they will join an American-led balancing coalition, so speaking about Japan, Russia, India, potentially, to check China's rise. Much in a way, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan eventually, China joined force with the US during the Cold War to contain the Soviet Union. And this is what we spoke of before about America ultimately being a power balancer to maintain their regional hegemon status, and they're not a unipolar power. Well, they may as well be, but they don't have full control absolutely everywhere. That, next page we want to go on to in here. So what will we see? Well, we'll see arms races. Yeah, no surprises there. We should expect to see proxy wars in which Chinese and American allies fight each other backed by respective patrons. Beijing and Washington are also likely to be on the lookout for opportunities to overthrow regimes around the world with a friendly to the other side. Most of these efforts will be covert, although some will be overt. We should also seek evidence of each side pursuing a bait and bleed strategy. So get your adversary into an attritional war when there is opportunity to lure the other side in a costly, foolish war. And in cases where there is no baiting, the other side nevertheless finds itself in a protracted war, which we could expect to see as a rival pursue a bloodletting strategy in which it seeks to prolong the conflict as much as possible. So, again, this goes into the real threat here. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't pose a threat. Conventionally, I don't think they pose a massive threat to NATO, that it is China that do this. But what we're going to see, as we do see the continuance of China's rise, and what then powers will do to try and balance this also, and America doesn't want to get stuck in a protracted war that is very costly and get in something that's bloodletting costly industrially and potentially economically and for human resource when we see that growth there. And that's a lot of the reason why the US want out of the conflict that is going on inside of Ukraine at the moment. And you've got to remember, Europe is their defence is smaller. Services like that are far more local looking than a country like America. And this is where you may see America back out of things or do really weird sorts of diplomacy because they're looking much, much larger. And we see bits and pieces like this too, which we shouldn't be surprised to see, of course, on tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, and then how there's interdependence even among states which may be adversarial as well. China's chokehold on this obscure mineral threatens the West's military. China produces the entire world supply of samarium, I don't know how to pronounce it, samarium, a rare earth metal that the US and its allies need to rebuild inventories of fighter jets, missiles, and other hardware. China's strict control on the export of heat-resistant magnets made with rare earth minerals have exposed a major vulnerability. Without these magnets, the US and allies in Europe will struggle to refill recently depleted inventories of military hardware. For more than a decade, the US has failed to develop an alternative to China's supply of a specific kind of earth. That China produces the entire world's supply here that is used almost entirely in military applications, hot enough to melt lead while not losing magnetic force. It's in the nose cone of missiles. China, on April 4, they halted the export of several kinds of rare earths, and they control most of the world's supply of these metals and magnets. And a lot of this is a big, big problem. And that there is a trade war, tariff war, sanctions war going on between these states now that hopefully doesn't slip into some kind of hot war. The American user of samarium is Lockheed Martin, an aerospace and military contractor that puts about 50 pounds of these magnets in each F-35. We continually assess the global rare earth supply chain to ensure access to critical minerals and support of our customers' missions. Remember what Mark Rutte was saying. That's why I put this in here, of we need that industry to be beefed up, and we're struggling on raw industry resource funding as well. And what he didn't touch on, what I think will be a huge problem, is just the manpower, the workers to actually beef that up as well, let alone the energy. And it's bits like this that are becoming a huge problem that was let to slip over a number of decades. Officials in the Biden administration were so concerned about the US military's lack of domestic samarium supply that they issued large contracts for the construction of 2 new plants. Neither was built because of commercial concerns, leaving the US entirely dependent on China. We see US and Europe, they're rushing to rebuild inventories of advanced weaponry. Their stocks have been severely depleted by shipments to Ukraine after the Russian invasion, and the US to Israel during the Gaza conflict. And what is then occurring there? That there's big, big problems happening in a lot of this industry that diplomats should never have let occur. And this is what we're seeing, is the tragedy of great power politics working in anarchic states. There's no police over the top here. And the greatest threat I see to the West is the absence of a coherent grand strategy. That our approach tends to be very reactionary, not proactionary, and it begins and ends with preserving the status quo of the Western world in the post-Soviet 1990s, even though we head full speed into a bipolar world. That our effort is put to just remain the status quo when that's not what's going to occur. And China, they have no interest in maintaining that status quo either. And that China, they will only work within these constraints and limitations when doing so serves its own interests. Yes, they will play ball, but they'll play ball as long as it's serving their interest, and then pull out if they then need to. And China adapts its new role as China adapts its new role to the new global order, we too must navigate the difficult transition into our new position and the competition that comes with it. So China, they are sort of learning the way of becoming so much more of a power, but we also need to adapt our position, saying, look, The 1990s might have been great with all the power and money that the West had, but that's not coming back. Maybe for a very long time, we have to adapt into, well, where are we going? And what most concerns me about the West is what actually unites us. Politics doesn't, religion doesn't, outlook on the world doesn't. It's more divided than ever, from nations to individuals. Within those nations, we lack a shared goal or belief. But to sum up everything we've gone over, maybe our politicians, instead of giving us a shared goal or belief, will offer us a common enemy instead, as a way to fix a lot of the issues we spoke about earlier in this around economy, industry, division as well. So are we going head first, full turbo into greater war? Is this going to stop here where America says? And what I say is, if you, Mark Rutte, have the fucking audacity to sit there and say that Russia is going to be a threat to NATO, to Poland, to Germany, to France, to America in 3 to 5 years, and then have the fucking audacity to turn around and go, yep, couple more billion to Ukraine and they will win, you should take a fucking good look in the mirror at what you are actually doing here and what we've spoken about in this part from Tatarigami UA as the actual survival and longevity here as well. Maybe some tough decisions need to be made before, instead of having 250,000 that are killed in this, we have 250 million killed. We will see, but the biggest threat is power politics, egos, and utopian politics as well. And you may hear me speak about my, what did I used to call it? Willie's theory of utopia, whatever I said, that I don't trust anyone who believes in utopias, because in order to get to that utopia, a normal, sane man will do horrific things. And you can see this in many, many aspects of ideology, to states, to individuals as well. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day. We're almost at an hour. It's been a while since we've done one of these, but I thought I just wanted to go down, lay a lot of foundation, and then we'll try and chip away on this. And what I want to give you guys is, as I am educating myself on this, I educate you guys, and then we don't need to go fully back over these topics when we mention it further in the future. So I can just say pseudo-environment and you and I know what we are on about. It's like a silent podcast or a one-way podcast. Have a fantastic remainder of your week, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.